Good morning, congregation. Don't you just love the book of Bereshit? You know, it's just so full of stories and characters and adventure. Today we got a really action-filled parasha for you. It's the parasha Toldot, generations or history, as it says up there. We just read Bereshit 25:19 to 23, Malachi 1:1 to 11. Not that often you hear that prophet. Romans 9:4 to 13. We're being told the story of two brothers, Esau and Yaakov. But it's not just the story of these two boys, these two men per se. There are forefathers, so of course we're interested in them, but it's also something much bigger. These two men, they're two icons for us, archetypes in a way. In the Haftorah, as we read, it says, Jacob God loved, but Esau he hated. And Jacob is later named Israel. He fathers the 12 tribes of Israel. He's given the promised land. He is a symbol of what it means to be God's. While his twin brother, Esau, he gives rise to the nation of Edom. And we read that God says that Edom shall be called a wicked land. The author of Hebrews teaches us by warning us from being like Esau. It's in a way a symbol of God's disgrace. This is the story of two brothers destined to journey as two opposite poles, always at war. And it makes me wonder, what is it that made one man so favored and the other not? We have this image in our heads maybe of the good brother and the evil brother. Intrinsically, one just emerged from the womb rotten and the other one jumped out like a saint. At least that's what it sounds like when we read Malachi. But if that was true, that would be the first and the last time in history when a human being could be so easily categorized and judged, to say that one is just pure evil and one is just pure good. The spiritual beings, maybe we can categorize in that way. God is good and he is just good, but humans, we're more complex than that. And when I read the parasha for today, it struck me that this brutally honest Bible narrative that we have doesn't make one brother out much different from the other. They start off their lives very similarly, and their decisions, it's a mixture of both the good and the bad. So when I read the parasha last week, I just asked myself, how come their destinies, their reputations ended up being so different? I want to have an honest look at the story of Yaakov and Esau today. Not the movie version of villains and superheroes, the honest version, the version that the Bible is actually given us. So it starts with Yitzhak and Rivka from Bethuel. We know her. We heard a lot about her last week. They had two sons, and from the womb they fought each other. And Rivka asked God, why is my pregnancy so hard? What's happening down there? This is very strange. And God said, well, these boys, they are to be rivals. Not only them, but their descendants. You have two nations in your womb, and the older is to serve the younger. First come Esau, all covered in hair, And then come Yaakov holding Esau's heel. And Yaakov, he was a quiet child. It says he liked to stay at home with his parents in their camp. We don't know exactly what he did in the camp. There are these narratives that says that he was sitting and studying, but back then there wouldn't have been that much to study. There were no books of Moshe and no books of the rabbis. Maybe he just liked to listen to the stories from Abraham, his grandfather. Maybe even actually from Shem, Noah's son, who was still alive. That would have been something to hear. Or maybe he was taking care of the animals and the crops at home. We don't know. But we know that Esau was quite different in that way. He liked to be out roaming the desert and the shrublands around their home, and as time went by, he became a skillful hunter. That's what he liked to do. We can ask ourselves if the boys knew the prophecy when they grew up. If they did, if they've heard what their mom had heard from God, that would be a reason for them to fight just for that reason. But in any way, we assume, because of God's words, that their childhood wasn't that peaceful. Boys fight, boys always fight, but we assume that these boys maybe fought a little bit more. And it says that Rivka, she preferred Jacob, the one that God had chosen. That's kind of what we would expect, right? She was a woman of God. Of course she would have preferred the one that God said that he loved. But their father, Yitzhak, preferred Esau. And it says that Yitzhak preferred Esau because Said Befiv. It's two Hebrew words that can be translated in two different ways. Usually we hear it translated as Yitzhak preferred Esau because he brought him wild-caught meat to eat, a nice barbecue. And we know that the way to a man's heart is through his stomach. So there is some sense in this. But somehow it's hard for me to imagine that this man who willingly, as a boy, lay down on that altar, ready to be sacrificed for God. You know, this man who was brought up by Abraham, who left everything behind him, who saw angels and spoke directly to God, that this son, Yitzhak, would prefer Esau just because he brought him nice food, although God was going to say that this son I hated. There is another reading of this phrase, and it's just as valid actually, and that is that instead of Esau placing this wild-caught meat in the mouth of his father, it says that Esau had entrapment in his mouth. That is, that Esau knew how to entrap, how to manipulate, how to enchant with his words. You can read it in that way as well. And that his father, then Yitzhak, was fooled by his words. That Esau presented himself like much better than he actually was. Rivka saw through it, but Yitzhak didn't. And I have a thought on this, and you don't have to agree with me. But to me, it seems like the text in many places seems to suggest that Yitzhak perhaps was being of a more trusting nature than what was good for him. No, he trusted his father to lay down on that altar, have him bind his hands, have him raise a knife over him. And that was all a good thing. But if you also look at last week's parasha, you will see that when Abraham grows old, he puts his servant as head of the house to take care of the household, not his grown-up son Yitzhak, but his servant. And when Abraham thinks it's time for his son to find a wife, he doesn't send his son to find that wife. He sends his servant to make that decision for him. I'm not saying that Yitzhak wasn't the great man of God. He was. But perhaps his great faith and trusting nature made him somewhat naive enough to favor Esau when God favored Jacob. We go on, and the boys become men. And one day we know Esau goes out hunting. Well, he probably goes out hunting most days, but this is a very special day when he goes out hunting. And his brother decides to go into the kitchen, right, and make a lentil stew, or a red stew, as it says. And we actually have ancient writings, engravings, that talks about ancient Mesopotamian cooking, and they mention the red stew. It seems like this was a favorite recipe of the time. Would men have been cooking at that time? Or was Jacob a very modern man? You know, it's hard to say because this was a long time ago, but we do have some research that said that still then, women did most of the cooking at home. But at that time, some men started to make it a little bit of a career for themselves, to become master chefs, cook these really fancy dinners for wealthy families. And if you think about it, Jacob and Esau's family was wealthy. Maybe Jacob was a chef. Maybe that's what he did when he was staying home in the tent. I'm not saying that that is true, but I'm saying it's a possibility when we're trying to depict these two men. So Esau comes back from the hunt, and he is very hungry. He says that he's dying of hunger, but I somehow doubt that that is the case. My husband can testify that I often come home from work and telling him, I'm dying of hunger. And that's exactly how it feels like. That's not a very pleasant feeling. It's a very strong feeling, and Esau is desperate. He's willing to give up anything for some of that lentil stew. So they make a deal, and Esau sells his birthright to Jacob, the right to take over from his father, to inherit a double portion, but most importantly, inherit the promise that was given to Abraham from God. And I know that Esau is usually the one who comes out badly from this story, taking his birthright so easily, God's amazing calling, just throwing it away like that. But Jacob is being far from the moral man that we often depict our forefathers to be. A loving brother would have given his hungry brother food without any cost. A godly man would have set his brother down by the fire, taken his cloak, fed him, maybe even like Yeshua teaches us, washed his feet. Instead, Jacob does the opposite and makes use of his brother's weakness. Now, Esau might not have cared much for his birthright in that very moment, but we know that when push comes to shove, he did care. He cried when he realized that this was all coming to an end. I said earlier that Esau might have been a manipulative person, fooling his father. Well, Jacob too knew exactly how to play on his brother's weakness. It's not exactly a sin what Esau does, selling his birthright. But one could argue that it is a sin what Jacob does, dealing with his brother in this way. Let's fast forward a little bit. Esau and Jacob are 40 years old. And Esau marries two Canaanite women. You might be thinking, Canaanites? That's bad, right? We don't actually have any record of God directly forbidding Esau to marry Canaanite women. We can assume that Abraham probably didn't agree, and we know that later on it would become forbidden. But this is the women that Esau chose. Jacob, on the other hand, remains unmarried for an unusually long time. We don't know why he waited. Now, surely a man from his family would have been able to get married if he wanted to. But maybe he just didn't have the same interest in women as his brother did. His mind focused on other things. Maybe he was waiting for true love. Or maybe he was waiting for his parents to kick him out and tell him to get on with it. Now, Esau married at 40, and his father, like we just read, also married at 40. Jacob was sent away, probably in his 70s, to go and find that wife. So he goes to his mother's family and he sees Rachel, and he falls in love. I think this is probably the most romantic story in the Bible. You men who are married in here, honest question, would you have worked 14 years to be allowed to marry your husband? Of course they would. Jacob does that, of course. Maybe he was a real romantic. Maybe he quite liked his single life. Two different options there. But he marries, probably in his 80s. He marries Rachel, and he also marries her sister Leah, of course. So, Yitzhak, their father, grows old. And he's starting to feel the age-related illnesses. He's starting to go blind, and he's worried that he won't be around for very long. So he calls his firstborn, Esau, to come and collect that blessing of the firstborn. He just wants one more thing. He just wants a little bit more of barbecue meat. And Rivka overhears the conversation. She tells Yaakov to go in, pretend to be his brother, and take the blessing. This is exactly what happens, of course. Yaakov gets the blessing from his father in this not so ideal way. Esau gets a blessing too, but not at all what he wanted, and he's very angry afterwards. He plots to kill his brother. So Jacob flees. Or rather, he does as he always does. He does what his mother says. His mother says, go and flee and hide with my family. So that's what Jacob does. And that is how Toldot, our Torah portion, finishes. But that's not how the story of these two brothers finishes. It has a really nice ending, actually. We can read about it in 2 weeks' time. It's this really beautiful sentence I want to read to you from that parasha. It says, Esau ran to meet Jacob and embraced him. He threw his arms around his neck and kissed him, and they wept. The two grown men, they wept for joy, one would assume, of seeing each other, for joy of finally embracing each other with that forgiveness. Now, the prophecy said that these two men would always be at war, and the nations coming from them would, but at that beautiful moment in time, they break out from that spiral of rivalry. They raise up above themselves and show that underneath all of that anger and violence, there was love. Now, they did what I think most of us would struggle to do, thinking about all the things that gone on in their past. They forgave each other, and I think that's something we really need to accredit to them. That's unconditional forgiveness. Anyway, Yaakov ends up fathering the 12 tribes of Israel. God's people, we know the continuation of that story. We are the continuation of that story. Still, God never abandons Esau, even if it may seem like that when you read certain scriptures and just pick them out. Actually, there is a Torah command from God telling us, Israel, that we should not hate an Edomite, that is the sons of Esau, that we should love them because they are our brothers. And remember that when Moshe was leading us into the promised land, many generations after these two brothers have passed, he tells us that we should be careful not to start fighting with Edom. So Edom is right there in modern Jordan. And he says, don't start a fight with them, because I am not going to let you get any of their land. He remembers that he has promised this piece of land to Esau and his descendants, and he's not about to throw this man to the wind. One good brother and one evil brother? One loved and one hated? That's clearly not the full story. Both brothers come with good characteristics, but also a whole pile of flaws. They're just very human. The story of our patriarchs and the matriarchs, they are just like this. You know, sometimes we as God's people, we have this idea of how a godly person should be, how they should look like. You should recognize them on the street because that's just the way they are. They're just so successful, and they have this godly family that is proof of a godly life, the perfect husband and the perfect wife and the perfect children, all living in perfect harmony. But remember the lives of our forefathers and our foremothers. The stories of deeply flawed people. You know, Yitzhak wanted to pick the wrong son against God's will. And probably that was only one of his many bad decisions that he did in his life. Rivka, who it actually seems like she wanted to be this good, submitted wife, she got frustrated with her husband, and in the end, she ends up undermining him, manipulating him several times. And Jacob, you know, at least before he has this great encounter wrestling with God, we read about a selfish and deceptive man. Amongst our ancient great, we find conflicts between spouses and children, problems with in-laws, lies, manipulation, rivalry, a whole lot of hurt and struggle. There's more things I could tell you about, but I just don't want to talk badly about our great. What I want to tell you is that, yes, they had flaws, but although they had all these flaws and the shortcomings, that didn't stop them from being chosen. How often do we not feel like we are not enough? Like we're just useless in the intimidating prospect of all these things that God wants to do with us and all these things that needs to be done in the world, the faulty lump of clay that he just simply can't form into a vessel good enough. You know, those high goals, calling for real superheroes. And here we are. And sometimes we do well, and sometimes we feel proud of ourselves, but a lot of the time, if someone had a good close look, they'd see all that mess. There have been times in prayer when I have told God that I can't possibly do what he wants me to do, that he should just go and find someone else, someone who's stronger, godlier, better. And yet the strange thing is that every time this happens, he tells me that I should get on and do it anyway. Now God chooses whom he chooses for his tasks, and it doesn't have to do with our great CV. If you can remember, there was one time in history when he chose a donkey. And I wonder if he isn't actually more likely to choose a donkey than a great mighty lion. Now, what is he going to do with a mighty lion? He has all the strength and all the authority in the world. He commands the armies of heaven. Even the strongest man in history, Shimshon, he wasn't actually strong in himself. He was only strong because God made him so. Scrape away all of that blessing, And he was just as weak as any one of us. Yeshua says something very interesting that you probably haven't connected with today's parasha and the story of Esau and Yaakov. He says, "The first shall be last, and the last shall be first." Doesn't he? Esau was the firstborn. He was the strong one. If someone was going to make a superhero movie about our brothers, Esau would be that superhero. Yet Jacob, the one born last, the quiet one, maybe a little bit awkward one, was the chosen one. And in their father's generation, Ishmael was Abraham's firstborn. Legally, he was, and a strong man, just like Esau. But he was born by man's power. The second-born Yitzhak was born against all physical circumstances, and he was chosen, although he was last. What does God say? "My grace is enough for you. My power is brought to perfection in weakness." That's the word, in weakness, not in strength. God's power breaks through. Ishmael and Esau, the legal firstborns, they could have decided to walk with God. There was nothing stopping them. They weren't pure evil. They were not excluded because they were evil. In fact, I think they probably knew God themselves. But God knew that they, as generations would go by, would reject him and put their trust in their own strength, build nations on their own strength. But they didn't have to. They were not forced to abandon God just because they were not chosen to directly father the Jewish nation. It's not about that. There are surely thousands, maybe millions of descendants of Esau and Ishmael who have joined God's people, who have converted, intermarried, wholeheartedly given their lives to God. These two people groups, nations, didn't have to walk away from him. They had a choice, but God knew. He just knew that as nations, not individuals, but as nations, they would walk away, and they were not chosen. God knew that the line that he wanted to choose was the one that on the surface looked weaker. But in the weakness, they would learn to lean on his strength. Yitzhak and Jacob didn't need to be strong or perfect in any way, and that's good because they weren't. They just needed to lean on God. And they did. They kept their faith. Through the generations when their brothers lost it, we know it, because we are here. And that's why they were chosen. They were the ones who knew how to lean on God for their strength. Let's bring it back to today before we finish. Let us not be discouraged by the obstacles that are in front of us that seem to be so overwhelmingly big, just too much for us to handle. Now, about all the different things that are going wrong in the world that are about to kill us. Antibiotic resistance, climate change, nuclear fallout maybe, economic collapse, or war. There's a lot of things out there that, if you look into the future, could kill us. But it doesn't matter what it is and how unprepared we feel facing it, how much bigger than us it is. Our God is not faced by it. And in one way, the bigger the obstacle, the better. He knowingly chose the flawed and the weak. He chose us. So that through his power, in our weakness, he can work miracles. Israel, the Jewish people, we've always been the small nation conquering giants. That's just what we are. That's the hallmark of what we are. Let the strong lean on their strength. Let them take care of themselves. At some point, they will reach their limit. But the weak, we can lean on God, who has no limit, who always wins. And that, if anything, should encourage us to keep on going, no matter how we're feeling inside, because we're walking with God, and He's strong for us. Shabbat Shalom.
That was fantastic. Thank you, Alan. It just reminded me of one of the readings that I had this week when I was studying, saying exactly that from Corinthians. And Shell was writing there that God has deliberately chosen the weak things of this world to put to shame the powerful in this world in its own strength. It's exactly the same sentiment. We're not embarrassed about being weak, being insignificant. I mean, sometimes we joke about it, don't we, that we're just a titchy congregation out on the outskirts of the UK. And yet, influence-wise, it stretches around the world. Why? It's not because of us, is it? It certainly isn't because of us. It's not because we've got an HD camera. It's got nothing to do with these things. It's because God does the work. If we lean on Him, and He chooses the weak things, we are weak. We have nothing to bring to the table. What have we got? What have we got to bring? Most of us would like to sit around a lovely log fire with a good book. To be honest, and yet God is doing an amazing work in these days around the world in Messianic Judaism. Moshe was the humblest man alive, wasn't he? Moshe didn't seek fame. I know he's been placed in that position, but you don't see Moshe saying, "Look at me, look at me, look at me." He didn't even get into the land, He just served God. It's that path of humility is so important. Be nothing. If you're nothing, you're everything in God's hands, isn't it? It's a wonderful truth. Amen.